Stan the History Man. Okay. Today, I want to talk about, well, I'll sing it to you. It ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so. And what is, I've a couple of things, a number of things that people think, just assume are true, but they're not. Okay. And I'll just look at the first one here is this is not the most important, but it's one I run across all the time from people who really should know better, at least older people. Okay, that is, they'll talk about the TVs of the 1950s, blurry or fuzzy images. Well, they weren't. The reason we think they are is because what you see now are kinescopes. And basically, they were a TV camera, a movie camera strapped to the lens of a TV camera. So there really wasn't much fidelity in that. But I remember, I'm old enough to remember, some classic movies like on the Colgate Hour and there were a lot of classical plays like Marty that I remember watching, and there was nothing fuzzy or blurred about. As a matter of fact, you can see actual photographs, still photographs of these programs, and they're absolutely clear, like a good clear black and white picture. So that you can throw that in the trash can, fuzzy or blurred. People just assume, well, if that's the back, that in the past they were more primitive than we are today, so they were blurred or fuzzy. They weren't. Okay, another one here is, oh yes, very common. Most people who are well read probably know this isn't true, but a lot of people do. Charles A. Lindbergh was the first man to fly the Atlantic. Well, he was about the 130th person to fly the Atlantic. What are you talking about? Well, you see, there were two British flyers, Alcock. Well, first of all, there were some American flyers who flew across the Atlantic from west to east, but they stopped at the Azores, so maybe that doesn't count. But then Alcock and Brown flew from, I think, Newfoundland to, they crash landed in Ireland. And they did that without, so that would be two guys who did that in 1919, 7 years, 8 years before Lindbergh. So they're the first to fly nonstop across the Atlantic. The Then where do all these big numbers come from? I don't know, 100 or whatever. A dirigible, the R-34, flew from England to Mitchell Field, Long Island, and it had about 100 in the crew, passengers and freeloaders and that type of thing. Interesting sidelight to this: the guy who parachuted out to tell the Americans how to handle dirigibles. We didn't know how to do that. He was the first person to arrive in the New World, not just America, not by sea. Okay, he parachuted out of a dirigible. Unfortunately, a side story to that side story was that the Major Pritchard was his name, was killed later on in a dirigible crash. I mean, let's face it, I got it worked out that every dirigible made by Germany after the war survived except for the Hindenburg we all know about. But every dirigible made, with one exception, made by other countries like the United States and Great Britain crashed with, of course, heavy loss of life. So anyway, I didn't want to get too much into the dirigibles, but the fact is that Lindbergh was far. As a matter of fact, believe it or not, Ripley, years ago, I think in the 30s, had a column, his Believe It or Not, and he said that Lindbergh was not the first. He got all kinds of hate mail. Oh, Lindbergh was the first, and he was the first to fly nonstop from New York to Paris, and that was the prize was given for that. And of course, Lindbergh's real genius was all the other flyers had multi-engine aircraft. He said that's that many more engines to go wrong, and it's a very light plane that's crammed with fuel, and some are really quite fancy. Admiral Byrd's attempted flight had the cooking facilities and no, he said, look, just keep it simple, and he made it. Okay, but he was not the first man to fly the Atlantic. Another one is Hiroshima was the worst, or Nagasaki. Well, people know mostly that Nagasaki didn't get as bad as Hiroshima, but basically Hiroshima was the worst of the bombings of World War II, and that's not true. The worst of the bombing was Tokyo in March of 1945. I mean, the city was gutted. I think about it, the city was actually destroyed, and it was incendiary bombing. And the Air Force, the U.S. Army Air Force in those days, figured that a lot of the Japanese structures were made out of wood, and so they'd go up, and they did. one of the justifications for it was that a lot of war industry was out amongst the people. It's like home, working at home or in the garage or something. Like many garages, but at home, and that was these were war productions or the war target. I really think, though, basically we have to admit that they just did this to scare the heck out of the Japanese and end the war that much more quickly. They came in low. The B-29 was made to be a high altitude bomber, and it was pressurized. The first Allied aircraft, first any aircraft on any scale, to be pressurized. But here they come in very low, sometimes beneath the Japanese radar, and they dropped out these incendiary bombs. And it was just a hell. About 100, over 100,000 died, and that's considerably more than, let's say, the 85,000 at Hiroshima. Of course, who's counting when you're talking about megadeath like that? In Europe, the first was the worst. I mean, was probably Dresden. I don't think there's any doubt about Dresden being the worst. Who knows, 30,000, 40,000. I mean, in one night. And again, it was a fire raid. You wouldn't think that a city built out of stone and brick like Dresden would burn. It was on Ash Wednesday of 1945, but it did. And again, but what are we? Why are we doing this? And even today, historians debate. Most of them say it was terror bombing. And as well, the Germans started, so we'll finish it. As the British said, they sow the wind and they reap the whirlwind. But there wasn't much war industry there. I mean, Meissen was known for his Chinaware, but it was a rail hub. And what made the casualties so horrible was there were a lot of refugees from the east. The Red Army was advancing rapidly, and they were fleeing to Dresden and then get on the trains there and go further away. But there's very little bombing of Dresden before the March 1945 bombing. And some people, it's the Reich's air raid shelter that for some reason, maybe because it's so beautiful, and it was, that's why we have refrained from, well, don't kid yourself. However, this, for the first time, there is a reaction. Like, now, wait a minute, we're just bombing a city here. This isn't Munich or Berlin or anything. This is a city known for beauty more than anything. And there were questions in Parliament about this. The Archbishop of Canterbury had a word to say about it. And so a couple of other cities, Leipzig and Magdeburg, I know Leipzig, was spared. They said, okay, look, the war is almost over. There's no sense killing a lot more civilians, basically. So let's knock it off. But and that the whole idea of mass bombing of cities has really been debated amongst historians to this day, because they'll say, well, you're just killing a bunch of civilians, and is that really our Western values? But others say, well, those cities, for example, anti-aircraft, something like 1 million Germans were involved in anti-aircraft. The artillery, the radar, the shelters, enormous amount of effort in construction, in anti-aircraft, that type of thing. And of course, it also, the first of them, the big one, was Hamburg in 1943, which really brought home to the Germans that this is serious, okay? Because I don't want to denigrate anything, but the German bombing of London was just not comparable to what we did back to Germany or Japan. So it's not a very happy chapter in history, and we certainly hope it won't be repeated. Finally, a slightly happier note, if you will. A lot of people think that Henry Ford invented the automobile. Well, of course he didn't. And a few better informed people say, well, he invented the first cheap automobile. No, he was the first to develop the inexpensive or cheap, if you will, automobile on any scale. I mean, there were cheaper cars before that, but I'll tell you, Henry's onto something that I don't think a lot of historians talk about, and that is it was not only cheap, though, it was well built. There's just more of it in luxury cars. But the Ford, Ford he was very big into racing in his early career, and he ran across at one race a wrecked French car that was thrown off into the ditch, and he noticed it wasn't that wrecked. And so he asked around, what kind of metal is this made of? And it was called vanadium steel. I don't know if it was a French invention or what, but vanadium steel was considerably stronger than the steel that they used then. And so you could argue probably the steel on a Packard or Duesenberg or whatever wasn't that much thicker than that on a Ford. They were, but there's just more to it than these other cars. They had more horsepower and everything. But Ford was the first to produce a good quality, cheap car. Europeans tried this with flimsy cars. like the German Kommensprot. The successor to Ford, though, was really the Volkswagen. Again, a car well built, and just there was less of it than, let's say, a Mercedes. Okay, that's the first, the certainly the logical successor to Henry Ford. And that, of course, was the engine for the sparking of the German revival after the war. So the Model T Ford, which was the cheap model, ran from 1908 to 1926, 27, when oddly enough was succeeded by the Model A. I mean, A comes before T, but the A model Ford succeeded the T model Ford. And you see a Model A today, and you think, boy, that's a square, boxy thing. And modern historians who should know better will talk about, oh, they're boxy and all. Listen, when that came out in 1920s, they closed down the plants for, oh, I said the better part of half a year, 6 months, maybe more than that. I mean, and it wasn't just done in one fell swoop, but basically they were closed down over the better part of 26, 27. And when that this is it, this is the new Ford. I mean, people by the tens of thousands swarmed into the Ford showrooms. Let me buy one. Let me buy one. Of course, it's the 1920s when people had that kind of money, but they were just swamped with people coming to see the new A model Ford. So that's Henry Ford's great contribution. That now later on I think he was probably getting a little senile or whatever, and he resisted a lot of changes for the better in the A model Ford. Just kept producing them and producing them. But still, it's I mean, the long run. Of course, the Volkswagen had the longer production run. The first Volkswagens, as you know, were started during World War. Well, actually, before World War II, and the Bug, I don't know when it stopped. I mean, they're making them down in Mexico into the 1970s. So that's both cars had the same idea of a cheap car, but not cheaply built, a rugged, cheap car. And that was Henry Ford's contribution to doing that. Also, he paid his workmen $5 a day, which, well, $5 a day. I mean, well, that was considered just fantastic. And when he announced this, it was in the dead of winter in Detroit. People were just climbing on the fences to get in, and they had to turn the fire hoses on them. They were so desperate to get in and make that $5 a day. And a lot of other manufacturers were saying, he's going to go broke now. You can't pay these guys, $5 a day. That's just it can't be done. But Ford, logically enough, said, well, I want my workers to be able to buy the cars that they built. And of course, that was very successful. And so that's what Ford is. He didn't invent the automobile. He didn't even invent the cheap automobile, but he invented the cheap, reliable, quality automobile. So those are some of the ain't necessarily so things that I thought I'd like to share with you. So I'd like to invite you to tune in again for another program of Stan the History Man, and I'll talk with you then. Bye bye.